listening to Conversations in Atlantic Theory, a podcast dedicated to books and ideas generated from and about the Atlantic world. In collaboration with the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, these conversations explore the cultural, political, and philosophical traditions of the Atlantic world, ranging from European critical theory to the Black Atlantic to sites of indigenous resistance and self-articulation, as well as the complex geography of thinking between traditions, inside traditions, and from positions of insurgency, critique, and counter-narrative. Along with dozens of scholarly articles and a handful of edited books and journal issues, Dr. Drabinski is the author of 7 books: Sensibility and Singularity, published in 2001, Godard Between Identity and Difference, published in 2008, Levinas and the Postcolonial, published in 2012, Glissant, The Middle Passage, published in 2019, and 3 recent books that are the occasion for our conversation: Atlantic Theory, So Unimaginable a Price, and At the Margins of Nihilism. He's also the co-editor with Michael Sawyer of Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy and co-host of both the Black Studies podcast and Conversations in Atlantic Theory. In today's conversation, we explore Dr. Drabinski's 3 latest monographs: in Atlantic Theory, where he traces the enduring legacies of slavery and colonialism while offering a comparative account of critical thought across the Atlantic world. In So Unimaginable a Price, he turns to James Baldwin, situating his work within a broader mid-century Atlantic context and placing it in dialogue with thinkers across the Caribbean and Africa. Finally, in At the Margins of Nihilism, he develops a theoretical framework through a comparative reading of Jacques Derrida and Orlando Patterson, drawing on figures such as Richard Wright, Frantz Fanon, and Baldwin to examine how different forms of nihilism operate as closed systems and how they are unsettled through vernacular practices of life and refusal. So we're here today with a special guest. We see his name on multiple platforms, but today here to talk about his own books. Welcome to your own podcast, Dr. Drabinski.
It's very strange. I know. I was thinking about that. Like, how do you be on your own platform? But it's fun. I appreciate you and Ashley making this space possible for me to talk about my books on my own platform. It seems a little narcissistic, but why not? It's in the end, it's about books and ideas, so might as well put mine out there.
And so today we are the ones asking the questions, and these questions are thought of and formulated also with Ashley, even though she's not here with us.
Yes, we're sorry you're not here, Ashley, but we'll take your place.
You, and you're still spiritually here.
Yes, there you go.
And so we like to start off by asking authors the origins of their project. What sort of concern, philosophical, personal, ethical, brought you to the questions in all of your 3 books? So Atlantic Theory, So Unimaginable a Price, and At the Margins of Nihilism.
So I'll start with the personal, actually, because, and I don't know if this is interesting or uninteresting, but I actually had my own kind of encounter with my mortality that got me to rush to write all 3 of these books. They were both about half to 2/3 written, and I just let them sit on my desk for a long time, which I think is kind of an obnoxious full professor decadence moment where there's like no rush to publish the book. I'll take my time. But I had really taken my time and just found myself wandering to new projects. I think like most of us, I get interested in a new project as soon as I'm deep in a project and can't figure out how to finish it. But at the time, I was 54, and I just had this moment where I was thinking about how long it would take me to finish these books, and then how long it takes to go through the referee process, through the copy editing, and waiting for it to arrive in book form as from the publisher. And I started to think, like, I'm entering that number in terms of my age, where I'm very close to a number where if I were to pass away, people would not say he died so young. So I didn't have like a health scare. I didn't think, oh, I'm going to die soon. But I was like, I've hit an age where I'm very close to not being, quote unquote, so young if I were to pass away. And this really like affected me. It was one of these like 3 a.m. thoughts. And I started to think, like, what am I going to do with these projects? And it just happened to be that the next morning I got up and went to a conference in Toronto. And when I was in Toronto, I was there by myself. I mean, I was seeing friends and people at a conference, but I just had this, a lot of time to myself on the plane, standing in customs in my hotel at night. And I started to think about it, and I said, like, let me get this done. If I can write all 3 books and get them done around the same time, maybe 2 of them will actually appear at the same time. It never occurred to me that all 3 would be good enough for referees. And so it turned out that way. And I will say that I really fell in love with the idea of coming out with 3 books. I was like, this is like a crazy thing to do. And I was like, well, I'll probably never be famous for what I say, but maybe I could be a little bit famous for that moment. Like when John had 3 books come out, that was weird. But the deeper reason behind the books was, for me, and they're each different this way, but I wanted to feature in the books different concerns that I have and different kinds of expertises that I have. In the case of Atlantic theory, it's a collection of essays, but they hold together around this idea of Atlantic theory. And that book is animated by the part of me that's a comparativist at heart, that thinks that it's really important to think across the Atlantic Ocean back and forth in a zigzag motion. And that zigzag motion for me is important because it's not just a sort of critique from the colonial, the colony of empire back to the heart of empire, but instead thinking in an entangled space and what it means to negotiate as a comparativist, but also as a close reader of texts, how people reckon with that entanglement, that inseparability that makes the Atlantic world the Atlantic world. And it was guided in some ways by, and this is in one of the essays on Senghor's anxiety of influence. Senghor's insight or claim in really early, really in the 1940s, before independence in Senegal, and just really at the beginning of his own writerly career, where he said he revisited the word assimilation. And he said, there's a version of assimilation that's alienation, but there's also this version of assimilation that's taking something in, right? And then making it a part of your body. And for him, and this is, I think, in some ways origins, the ideological and spiritual origins of negritude in that context, which was just this lack of concern with the colonizer, that in the case of Senghor, that Senegalese culture had nothing to fear from being in contact with France, that it was strong enough, it was bold enough, that it could have a digestive relationship, right? That French, the encounter with the French, either the French language or with French literary and philosophical traditions, that there was something to be enhanced in terms of Senegalese thinking. And I like that because of the way, for me, it really changes this notion of entanglement to say, like, the colonized are not simply victims of the colonizer. They actually are working with ideas in this really creative, important space. And I'd seen that in the sort of post-Fanon Caribbean, and that's a huge part of the project as well. And in the United States, this series of thinkers who were encountering the sort of heart of empire in a way that wasn't simply rejection or reactivity or negation, but instead a kind of insurgent, kind of interruptive version of assimilation, of taking it in and regurgitating it as something unrecognizable to that empire. So I think that book is animated by that spirit. It's also animated by a concern with debates in Caribbean theory that for so many people, I think the Caribbean thought ends with Fanon, right? But there's all this tradition and sort of making afterwards with Glissant, Chamoiseau, others, and thinking critically back to Césaire and to Fanon was important for me to sort of draw a larger sense of that tradition. So that's a lot of words about Atlantic theory. In the case of So Unimaginable, a Price, It's my first and only book that's really on the U.S. And I never worked just with English language sources. So I was amazed how much more quickly things go when you don't have to check translations and all of that. But also was a long time teaching interest and some writing and editing, but mostly a teaching interest in Baldwin. And I said, do I have something to say? And what I think I had to say was what came out of Atlantic theory, which is a concern with the Black Atlantic as its own intellectual space and intellectual event. And I thought, what would it mean to read Baldwin from that perspective as part of the Black Atlantic, even when he's not talking about those other figures, but reading him in that context because that context is so powerful, or that's what I wanted to claim in Atlantic theory. And then At the Margins of Nihilism, that was actually supposed to be a much, much longer book to where I've been working in Black Studies departments for 20-something years at this point. But my earliest career was in philosophy departments. And one thing that's kept with me from my time in philosophy was the work of Jacques Derrida. And deconstruction continues to be such an important part of how I read and how I think. And I just had this moment actually on Facebook, of all things, where I said, I'm writing this essay. I'm probably the only one who's interested in reading Derrida and Orlando Patterson's notion of social death together. And a bunch of people were like, no, I'm interested too. And maybe, I don't know if it's like it felt supportive or if it was like a assurance I needed. There was something that got me very excited about that. And then I thought, maybe I have something to say that's a little bit more original than just quote unquote a reading, which is what Atlantic theory and So Unimaginable a Price, they're just close readings or big recasts of thought, right? Both at the same time. And I think At the Margins of Nihilism is a much more creative book. I wouldn't say it's in my voice because it really is like a chapter on Fanon and Richard Wright, a chapter on James Baldwin, a chapter on Patterson and Derrida, a chapter on Afro-pessimism. But it's for me, a really creative approach, and where I feel like that's my voice as a theorist. And I was like, again, back to what I was saying initially, having that mortality moment, I think I was like, when am I going to just write something that's my own voice as a theorist? Like really just boldly put it out there where I don't have to explain why I would read Zora Neale Hurston and Gloria Anzaldúa together. I just do it. Why am I talking about Jean-Marie Thénault and Ousmane Sambin? Because I want to, because that's my theoretical route. And I said, let me just write a book and see if it works. There were also supposed to be chapters on John Locke, not Jean Locke. See the English. Yeah. John Locke, that's my name too. John Locke, Immanuel Kant, and G.W.F. Hegel. The referee, I won't say her name, I know who she is, brilliant reading of the book, said, that's a separate project, and I pulled that out. And it really allowed it to really be about pessimism in the Black intellectual tradition, but also a clearer sense in which I could have my own voice as a theorist. And so the books in some ways are very different, but they were motivated by a little bit of mortality. Let me show some of my skills as a reader and writer. And also let me go ahead at this point in my life and just write something that feels like my own original voice as a theorist.
And another thing that came out of this, because I did remember you were writing the books at the same time, but you also had a phenomenal process of the word count. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh,
and the notebook
I remember it.
you had.
I have the notebook. I won't pull it out because we're not doing video, but I have it right there in my left drawer.
People are going to send you an email, be like, can I get a picture of the notebook? It becomes part of like a museum archive in this little box. But many questions, and it's funny how you started off. I don't know if that was intentional when you started off with Atlantic theory and then went to So Unimaginable a Price. But I did start with Atlantic theory, and then I went to The Margins of Nihilism, and then my last book was So Unimaginable a Price. But for those who are wondering, is there an entry point as to, well, maybe there was an intention to maybe start off with this book that can understand this book a little bit better? Or there is no sort of entry point. And another question, just so you can sort of like melt it all together. What is the continuous thread from your previous books, and then what's the breaking or the new ideas from these 3 books?
I think in a weird way, the entry point to all 3 books is my book, Glissant in the Middle Passage.
I love that book.
Oh, thank you.
Highly highlighted. Yes, heavily highlighted.
I like that book still.
Yeah.
I remember writing it and reading the page proofs, and I was like, I think this is pretty good. And I was like a little shocked because usually I just want to burn a page proof and just go ahead and publish it because I want something with my name on it. But what that book was interested in was the proliferation of difference as something that's productive of thought rather than something that confuses or creates a sort of discombobulation of thinking. And so part of it is sort of part of what leads to and threads these 3 books together is that notion of difference that comes out of the Glissant in the Middle Passage book, but also that Glissant's emphasis on entanglement and what it means to both see the Atlantic world as an entangled intellectual space, while at the same time being an intellectual space in which there is such deep specificity, and that every site is its own kind of event. I think this is something that an insight that could only come, why not be hyperbolic? I love the Francophone tradition this way. I'll just be hyperbolic. Could only come from a place in which Creole languages are central to the formation of a people. And that Glissant's notion of Creole as formative of a people is archipelagic, right? It's fragmented. Each island has its own Creole. So it's site-specific, but also part of this massive multi-century event. And so I think the thread that holds them together in the sort of entryway is sort of that. I think you have to, or I want people to have that sense of the productivity of difference, the sort of astonishment and wonder that comes from a sense of entanglement that's not simply a unidirectional, oppressive structure of empire, but instead we can have these complex relationships to lineages of thought. And so to be able to do the comparative work in Atlantic theory, that book is in some ways a Glissant book because it's just the way Glissant loved to read, and the way he loved to engage, Deleuze or Guattari or Fanon or Derrida or whoever he was reading, Victor Segalin, of course. But also Senghor, again, to reference that, the very early essays on education and assimilation, I just think, those essays in Atlantic theory make sense to me because of that notion of entanglement. But also what comes out of that notion of entanglement is a double reading or doubled meaning of the pain of history, that the pain of history is fecund. Right? It decimates, Glissant says this is a middle passage, the abyss, but there's also something to be said in the wake of pain or in the midst of pain and the inheritance of it. And I think that that's where So Unimaginable, a Price draws with its notion of inheritance, which I really put at the end in the postscript, but it animates the book, but also in the first chapter on origin stories. That one of the things I think is so important to understand conceptually about Baldwin is that the auction block is the origin of African American identity. That's not just that African Americans are damaged and fragmented, but also that the cry of that moment creates an entire world and an entire tradition. That then becomes a centerpiece, really through Ralph Ellison and Zora Neale Hurston in At the Margins of Nihilism, that the world made out of pain is not reducible to a relationship to white people, right? But it's his own world at the margins of nihilism. And that margin, thought deconstructively, is this entire world that can't be reduced to what white people have made of it, but is its own thing, what Baldwin called, as his phrase, the relation that Negroes bear to one another. And that sense of the margin, that sense of world making is only possible, I think, because for me as a reader and writer, because of what I learned from Glissant about the Middle Passage and how the Middle Passage is a womb as well as an abyss.
And at least I know for me, two things that pointed out through a thread throughout the books was refusal.
Yes.
What do you do with refusal, and refusal as world making? And another was Afro-pessimism, because you touch on it, but you touch on it in different ways.
Yeah.
And I paused because I'm doing my degree in comparative literature, but you make sure to really point out the way you're not necessarily doing comparative work in the same way in each book.
Yeah.
And I think that's also something I remember you put in the book, we've talked about it, you're like, you are thankful for for Orlando Patterson's audaciousness to write a book on social death. It's an audacious claim. And that's something I know I try to remember as a writer. If you're going to write, then have the full audacity to say what you want and mean what you say.
I love audacious writing. I mean, I've said this a million times, but that's why I've always loved the Francophone tradition. It just, across all geographies, they just love the hyperbole. Like in this essay, history comes to an end and begins again. And it's just kind of a mediocre essay. But, I love why not?
I remember that's one of the things that also pulled me in, because I'm like, wow, but then they'll turn around and you're like, wait a minute. And they're like, I know I said this, but here's another claim.
Yes,
you're like, just the audacity of
I love it. I mean, what's the point of writing if you're not just going to go wild at some point? My books don't have a wild moment, but I love the people who do. So,
but it is wild in the sense of thinking, and I think that's the part. Like even this, what I was able to see, this pattern of refusal, of what you're trying to have us. Instead of thinking of refusal as this complete just rejection, move away from, same with the thinkings of assimilation, but what can you actually do with that in terms of world making, world building? What would happen if we thought of refusal in a different way? And then you do the same thing with Afro-pessimism by adding nuance to the conversation of, it's not about just adding this positivity, but it's sort of like, well, what if we try really not to go to the cynical, spiraling, and think of what can come of this, what can be birthed from this. And it just really makes you think about things, thinking about the root of the words and how we use them, how it gets remixed by the colonized, as opposed to, oh, they're just victims.
Yeah, I think, the phrase that I haven't used that I think actually is maybe the best way of thinking how the books thread together is vernacular culture.
Yeah.
And that how seriously we take vernacular culture is, for me, one of the most important questions we could ask as theorists. And I ask it in each book in different ways, but in the end, I think it really does come down to just my claim that everydayness is actually the deepest root of critical theory. That critical theory doesn't override everydayness, that everydayness and everyday culture, the commonplace and the commonplace, right, are actually very subversive to the way we think. And for me, that was important. And this is why Afro-pessimism was an important point of contact for me. Because I did have friends who were just like, why get in those debates, maybe, right? Which is not an unfair thing to say. And then other people were like, why take it seriously? People who really dislike it. And I was like, well, I think that this notion of like the social life of social death that Sexton talks about, I'm like, that's kind of a final horizon for critical theory. Like if you cannot... If we concede that, then what critical theory is absolutely receives its final shape. I think it's a version of the end of history in some way. It's like Fukuyama and Sexton. Maybe there's an essay to be written there at some point. But I was like, if the social life of social death, if that's what Black social life is, then I don't think we've taken vernacular culture seriously. And for me, it wasn't about just like giving like vernacular culture its flowers or a kind of affective thing, but instead sort of as you reminded me, thinking of refusal as a precondition, right? But a precondition of vernacular culture that actually has deep epistemological and ontological consequences. It's refusal is a relationship to being and a relationship to knowledge. And that's where Patterson and Derrida helped me think, right, about how refusal is an ontological intervention, that it's a movement against being itself, if being is formed by the interracial. And I think that in the end, Afro-pessimism needs that notion of the interracial as the final horizon of being. But this notion of the otherwise is so important for me, because the otherwise is vernacular culture formation. It's world making at the margins of nihilism. That's the reason for that title. But also is just that way of saying vernacular culture is not just an interesting thing to study. It's actually the way that people survive. It's also the way people thrive. And it's the way people become a people. And again, I get that from Glissant, where he's like, Caribbeanness is its own thing. And we can't think Caribbeanness in terms of negritude or African-Americanness or indigeneity. It has to be thought on its own terms, because its vernacular cultural formations are responsive to a particular imposition of the interracial that is colonialism in the Black New World. And I was like, let me expand that thought and see how it changes the way I think and read some of these really important ideas in Afro-pessimism, but also in James Baldwin scholarship, in Fanon's scholarship, and also tracing like how somebody like Angela Davis in Atlantic Theory, the long essay on Angela Davis, because I was like, I know Angela Davis is a sort of face of resistance, and rightly so, but her Blues Women and Black Feminism book is a story of what we would now call refusal and vernacular culture, and shows how deeply political it is, but also how it creates other worlds, specifically around gender and race. And I was like, this is like it's like a counter tradition inside the tradition of the Black intellectual tradition.
Reading the books also did make me think of, and I thought of this because you discussed this in one of the many classes I've taken, Césaire's call for a discussion also needs to be had around the colonizer, not only the colonized.
Yeah.
The root of that essay being colonizers also need to take a look at themselves in the mirror.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh, that's another way of not pointing the finger, but saying, what made you the way you are? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what you thought these decisions and these actions, why? What's wrong with you? And I was like, oh my goodness, so I don't know how it connects to the books, if it does, but especially when you were talking about the otherwise, and it was like, what caused there to be an otherwise? That was one of the thoughts that came to me. So.
It's interesting that you say that, because at the margins of nihilism, I mentioned before that it had a chapter on Locke, a chapter on Kant, a chapter on Hegel. I pulled that out because, again, referee was like, I don't think this quite works. But that is a separate project that I started. I was like, I'm going to come out with the fourth book immediately after the 3 books. And then I was like, let me garden for a while. Take a deep breath and go to the gym, eat healthy.
I mean, take a walk.
Take a walk, something. And so I put it aside. But the tentative title of that project is Decolonizing the Colonizer, a subtitle. I'll come up with some cool title that will get rejected, and in the end it'll be called, I think, Decolonizing the Colonizer. There's a dialectic of titles with my books anyway. But that idea of decolonizing the colonizer is so important, and I think that is a part of a number of the essays in Atlantic Theory of saying, like, why is it that multiple centuries of entanglement, again, this word entanglement is so important that I get from Glissant. Why is entanglement so important for the colonized, but never important for the colonizer? Paul Gilroy also says this in Postcolonial Melancholia. It's like, at what point do we say, well, the whole white Western tradition is also entangled with empire? I think, Locke, Kant, and Hegel, these are real signature figures of the tradition. They're the origins of so much race discourse, so much justification for slavery and empire. And so for me, that was an important, that project will be important for that reason, but also just to turn that gaze back, right? And that's, and as you said, that has roots in Césaire when Discourse on Colonialism. He's like, Europe is sick. So I think there's lots of ways when he says Europe is sick and it's indefensible, to see that as a great rhetorical kind of like, fuck you to empire. And it absolutely is that. That's a manifesto as much as it is an analytical text. But I'm like, part of being a reader is also that moment where it's like, well, if it's sick, what would it mean to address the sickness? Not to heal, to get back to the old body, but what would it mean to address the sickness? If it's indefensible, what would it mean to think about Europe after the indefensible? That's another title I had sort of toyed around with, Europe after the indefensible or something like that. I think Derrida's kind of tried to think a little bit about this. Unfortunately, it never preoccupied him for like the 5-year thing that would allow him to write 8,000 pages that we would then all learn from. But that entanglement has to go both ways. And the way that white Europe has gotten off the hook for so much of this, while also being totally dependent on empire for its own self-conceptualization, self-realization. I think the place where I do it most clearly is in one of the chapters, part of one of the chapters in the So Unimaginable, A Price, where I talk about Baldwin's negative dialectics of race and how for him, he makes an argument, I think it's an easy argument, but it's a profound transformative one, that white Americans are dependent upon Black abjection for their own identity. And that's why Faulkner, for example, says the civil rights movement has to move slowly. It's like not just he's an old racist white man, which he may or may not have been. What I think Baldwin finds interesting and what I find interesting is this idea that Faulkner, more than any other white writer maybe, understood the entanglement of white people with anti-Black racism in the United States. So the go slowly was like, so we can remain a people or figure out who we are after this. I like Baldwin's response, which is, no, we're not going to wait, right? Figure it out later. But the insight is about that notion of entanglement. Again, that's where the Glissant for me is the antechamber to all this.
And it's very true. At least I know when I was still studying, the rhetoric and just the nationalist discourse of like France specifically, they've absolutely built their identity on the backs of the absence or the lack of, quote unquote, of these Negroes they've encountered. Like from the travel logs, I mean, it's so deep that you're like, no, this has been circulating as soon as they could get on a ship. I mean, this was like the travel logs that they sent back. So it's like to undo things from the 13th century, and it's like at the time you think, well, for them, it might have been harmless, right? These periodicals that would show up of like the travel logs I would send back. But it's like, no, this formed, like reading in newspapers and how you could and this is like small case scenarios of when a grandma would say like, oh, what did people who went abroad today say about, the people they encountered? And it's like, oh, they're saying they're not wearing clothes. It's like, what? It's like these things, and it's sediments from one century to the next. And this is how they've built their national identity.
Yeah. And taking that seriously as, and this is, I use it, I think probably in all three books, but definitely in the Baldwin and the Atlantic Theory book, and I say it all the time in class, so I'm sure you've heard it many times, and any student of mine has heard it a million times, where I say colonialism was a total project, meaning there was not an aspect of European culture and world making that was untouched by empire. The philosophers, the scientists, the theologians, the creative writers, the painters, everybody rallied to the cause of empire. It had to be justified. I mean, you're just massacring millions of people, right? It does require justification. And so you need everybody on board. But if everybody's on board justifying something for centuries, it becomes part of who you are. There's no such thing as justifying something as a side project when every aspect of your
Mm-hmm.
culture is on board. And as you say, those travel logs are the first wave of all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And also this like travel, the idea that we would be dependent upon like, empire entangled with travel in this case.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, this is about big historical stuff, but it's like something everybody says when they travel somewhere. Like, I feel like a different person, or like it changed me, or I came to a different kind of self-understanding. I mean, that's a boring trope and kind of something we might make fun of if we studied abroad in college and we laugh at ourselves or whatever. But it's a real insight that travel changes who you are.
Yeah, it does.
And empire is that way that in the imagination, you are always traveling, in the sense that you are always imagining this other. Every war, right? We're recording this as the United States has started to, mass murder Iranians for, we'll figure out what it is in 10 years. I'm not sure why. But, you see that like Americans are being invited to, and whether people are or not, whether or not the war is successful as a national event, but invited to see themselves in relation to this. Like they are these kind of people, we are not. And it becomes this really important moment for like the way war, and war is a kind of empire that way. War is this way of discovering yourself as a nation.
Yeah, very much so. And the conversations online, at some point you step away, but you can see a lot of people doing a lot of like identity problem solving. Well, if I am, or if I agree with you on this, then what does this mean for me? And what does this mean for my family and where I come from and where they come from? And this like deep lineage spiraling of, so then what are we? And who are we? Most times it's a dark place. It's a dark place. But ultimately, it's this realization of what have we been fed? What have we been like? What story have we all bought into, to a certain degree, right? Some more than others.
And those stories make us who we are. It's not. They're not entertainment or horror alone. Yeah, because as you said, like it's this identity spirals, and one of the things, especially Atlantic theory, and I mean, it's just my deepest like interest as an intellectual, is just the ways we are caught up in those things at the level of identity rather than just atrocity. That atrocity makes identity. And taking that seriously is very terrifying.
It is.
That's why nobody... That's why people recoil in such horror as intellectuals. I'm thinking like when something's revealed about the person who they write about and they feel deep intellectual debt to, and it turns out, like Heidegger was like a murderous, like anti-Semite, like as a person. And that only matters because, you understand the entanglement of his ideas with the world, and now your entanglement with those, right? People get defensive and aggressive or shamed or whatever the range of emotions because we know that identity is at stake. And like, what does it mean to just not assume, but to work with the fact that all of these intellectuals were like that. They all were a part of a world. That Baldwin was part of a Black Atlantic world, whether he read Césaire or not. Yeah. He was a part of that world. And that, starting with that genesis of ideas and arguments and concepts, for me is, it's all I've ever wanted to do was sort of, well, not all I've wanted to do since my second book. I think my first book, I was a little too naive, but I figured that out along the way. But it's such a voracious way of thinking that way. And, I think like, I work in Black studies, and I think this is one thing that Black studies, I want Black studies to do more of, is thinking about the entanglement of some of the central concepts of the field with empire, and think transnationally, think across the Atlantic world. So much of it is nation-based or region-based, a Caribbeanist, an African-Americanist, Afro-Latino studies, African studies, the whole continent.
Lusophone, that's what gets you.
Yeah, but I'm interested in those moments, and Baldwin does it with race, where he's just like, race in the United States is an entangled phenomenon, and thinking about all of our central concepts as entangled, it's, it puts you on, it's like trying to walk on water sometimes, you just sink. But I think we got to sink a little bit, to make those concepts less comfortable and less ease with them than I think we often are as writers.
And where did the title then, So Unimaginable a Price, comes from? Because I feel like we've been sort of like talking about it, but how did you get to that?
So it's a quote from Baldwin.
Okay.
So there was actually, I thought it should have a quotation mark around it in the title. And then the editor was like, everybody will know it's not your phrase. And I was just like, what if people thought I was clever enough to come up with that? She's like, they're not going to think that. Faith. You're probably right, but maybe you're wrong. But no, it comes from Baldwin. And this idea of price is really important to him, that the price of the ticket is the title of his collected nonfiction. And this in one of his essays, very late essays. And so this idea that we pay a price to be who and where we are, I think for me it's a great word to think about what I had been talking about with entanglement, that entanglement has such a price.
It does.
And, but everything that has a price, you also are acquiring something, and thinking about what it means to have given or had taken from you this price, something exacted from you, whoever the you is, in this case, Baldwin, African Americans, what it means to have something extracted, but also then what comes after that price, like what's been acquired. In Princes and Powers, he's like, my ancestors, he says, I claim a home here because my ancestors like worked this land and bled into it, right? And he doesn't say price there, but it's like, that's the price. And what you get for that price is a sense of home. All the paradoxes that come with that. But so I was very interested in that idea of price generally as like one word, an English word, and an American word. So it's a word that like I have like a deep connection to because it's a word that circulates in my world. That's not a translated word, even just across different English geographies or Englishes. It feels like indigenous to my own language. And then So Unimaginable was that moment where, for me, it was really important that Baldwin was like, but this is not a price that we can actually like fathom. It's an unimaginable price. And for me, that's part of the deep ethics that Baldwin has around inheritance. That if an unimaginable price has been paid, then we need to inherit the past with immense care and ethics and handle it with real tenderness and concern. So for me, it's like this provocative phrase of deep ethical meaning, but also a deep origin story about how places are transformed by prices paid.
And it does take us inheritance, and in that auction block, just sort of remembering that and knowing there's an inheritance that comes with it.
Yeah, if we hear the sound of the auction block in vernacular language and culture, that's a moment of inheritance that makes something beautiful. But it's something that's beautiful that comes from an unimaginable price. And thinking those two things together, it doesn't resolve. It's a contradiction, and we have to live with it. I love Baldwin's resilience around we have to live with that. Again, Glissant has the same thing about the shoreline. He's like, this is a graveyard of millions of Africans, the ocean, but also this Caribbean shoreline is the most beautiful place on earth. And what does it mean for both those things to be true? And they don't reconcile. There is no dialectics to this. So, I don't like dialectics. My friends are all dialecticians at some point. And this is why I don't like dialectics. This doesn't resolve, and we have to live with both of them. Yeah.
And so readers take away what they will from books. And so while you were writing, did you have an imagined reader in mind?
Imagine reader. I mean, this was a question
when the question gets posed back to you.
Yeah. No, I remember, you and I were coming up with questions for the Conversations in Atlantic Theory podcast. I was like, this is a good one. And then I'm like, shit, you're going to ask me that? And that's a hard one for me. I don't know that I ever really felt like I understood who an audience would be. Definitely critical theory people. And, but also Black studies people. And those two things aren't separable. I mean, Black studies has a critical theory tradition, and that's really what it's written in. But one of the things I wanted to do in terms of audience was for critical theory readers, so theoretical readers, to see the importance of the everyday and the vernacular. That this was something I was taking from these really important texts and trying to formulate as a deep theoretical position. I'm going to go ahead and call it a deep theoretical position. That's my hope.
You
right?
have the audacity here.
A deep theoretical claim about vernacular culture. And so for theorists, it's this reminder that the everyday has, through refusal, a whole different story to tell for our theoretical concerns. And attending to that everything might hang in the balance. But also for cultural studies people, people who work with, say, on blues or jazz or soul or R&B, African-American traditions in particular, because I don't really talk about Caribbean music, that people who work in cultural studies, I also wanted them as an audience to say, like, here's what a theorist does with the kind of work that you're doing. But also that might shift the work that you do in cultural studies a little bit, because it becomes less about historical context and more about this wide trajectory. I think that's what theory allows us to do, is see these long stories that are bearing on a 20-year moment, right? If we're going to talk about soul as like a period in African-American music and African-American culture, it's like Baldwin's conception of the auction block tells us that this is the origin of African-American life, right? That's being heard in this moment. That requires a critical theory apparatus that I think all three books try to engage with, that allows cultural studies that is very attentive to specificity. And I love that. To also say, this is part of this huge arc of what it means to be in this particular intellectual and cultural tradition, right? In the same way that for the people who write and think and love that big arc tradition, right? The critical theory people, it's like, but really this is showing up in everydayness. And there are people working in that everydayness. And we also have to see everyday culture as something more than abstract or distraction or the social life of social death, or as kind of fan treatment, that I love this and so I'm going to write about it. There's nothing wrong with being a fan-oriented writer, right? I think one of my next projects is kind of a fan-oriented project. But to understand that fan-oriented project is also unearthing or engaging with something that's one moment on this long horizon that critical theory allows us to see, and that critical theorists have to remember that all the clues, all the leading clues, the Leitfaden, are there to point us to critical theory in the everyday, in historical periods, the spirituals, at the turn of the century, right, all the way up to soul music, R&B, hip hop, jazz,
hair, just all the things. Yeah. It's just all the everyday things. That's why I chose Maryland, because I could do this untangle and or just engaging with knots in a way that, as much as you want to sort of undo the knot, I don't have to. I can understand how the knot was made, but also why the knot maybe keeps making more knots, and what's the purpose of this knot? Because there's a purpose to someone. But I like that knot work.
It's funny you say that. I hadn't thought of it until you just said it, but I even since I was a little kid, I've always loved knots, looking at them, and people have, I always had friends who learn how to, like a hobby kind of thing or thing to play around with as a little kid, like learn how to tie all these different knots. And there's always little like graphics on how to do step by step. I just love looking at them. I'm like, they're so symmetrical. Why when you pull, does it get tighter and never looser, right? Those. So I was interested in like knots as like their own aesthetic, right? Rather than like how to make them. So that may be actually the origins of all of my thinking.
Knots.
So we may have discovered, there's a version of like a combination of like psychotherapy and like maybe new concepts for me. So.
And to return that question to you, how did finishing all 3 books leave you? New sensibilities, new curiosities. I'm sure exhaustion is somewhere in there, but...
Well, exhaustion is funny how quickly exhaustion goes away when the physical copy shows up with your name on it.
Yeah.
I've told this many times. I'll say it again. I remember being at McGill University at a conference. I forget what it was. And Simon Critchley was there. And I was sitting with him, and there were a few graduate students, I think from the new school, like his graduate students, or maybe graduate students at the conference. And they were sort of enthralled by Simon. He's a very charismatic person. He publishes millions of books. And somebody said, one of the students said, "Why do you write so many books? Are you just so full of ideas?" And Simon said, and it's funny he said this, and I remember when I was first in graduate school, he had just published his first book and came and gave a talk. We shared the same PhD mentor, and he said the same thing about his future books, and this was after many books. And he said when he was in Memphis in 1992, after Ethics of Deconstruction came out, and he said, I just want more books with my name on them. And then this was, I don't know, like 2014 or 12 or something. And the student was like, "Why do you write so many books?" And he says, "I love having my name on it. My name on a cover just thrills me." And they laughed. And I looked at him, and he like looked at me, and he was like, "I'm dead serious." And I was like, "I think Simon's serious." And so the exhaustion goes away because I do love that.
Yeah.
They all included, I always have to correct the proofs that included my middle initial. It's like John E. Drabinski. I always say, because that's my grandfather's name. Irwin is my middle name, so I like to have that out there. But also, up until I was in grad school, everybody called me Johnny, so now it's John E. professionally. But it left me outside of the sort of tired, let me see what happens, then the thrill of getting them. One of the things I think it really did very deeply was get me to ask myself, when am I going to write a book that's just about vernacular culture instead of a thing that comes to vernacular culture as this important theoretical intervention?
I too have been asking you this question.
You have been. You're just like, why not just do it? Why sort of dance around it? And, there've been a few people, you and I have talked about that. I was doing a podcast on Black ephemera for the Conversations in Atlantic Theory with Mark Anthony Neal, and was talking to him a little bit about this after, just chit-chatting after the recording. And he said, he was just like, "Why don't you just write a book? Got all these ideas about soul music and time and Memphis.
And movies, like,
cinema, exactly." And he's just like, because that book's about music, we were talking about music, and he's just like, "Just do it." I was like, "I don't know." And he was just like, he kind of like rolled his eyes in a friendship way. But I was like, I need somebody to roll their eyes a little bit. Just like, why not, man? How many books and articles do you have to have before you're like, let me just write my own voice? I think At the Margins of Nihilism got me closer to my own voice. I don't think anybody reads that and is like, hey, this is like his voice. But as a writer, it was. Because it has a creative synthesis, and I'm unapologetic about it. I'm not trying to justify why Patterson and Derrida go together. I'm like, I'm going to read them together and do this with it. The preface and the postscript of At the Margins of Nihilism, because that was the last book that I finished, are on Samben and Tenno. And I was like,
You're doing it.
That's me trying to do that and trying to make myself say, like, let's set yourself a new standard. So I think it left me with, just having written theoretically about vernacular culture, it confirmed to me, it made me feel good about my commitment to vernacular culture as this important event of thinking, but also left me with the challenge that I need for myself to become a different kind of writer. Because, the mortality thing is real. Like, I turned 58 this year, not till October, but I turned 58 this year. And that's congratulations.
You made it this far.
Closer to congratulations. I'll make it. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, who needs my little sisters when you're here to be like, congratulations, making it this far, old man. But it is really one of these things where if I step outside myself, I'm like, who is 58 and still thinking, should I write this way? Like, just write your thing. That's something Mark said. He was like, it's like, just write. You're old enough. Like, who are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? And I think I left with a deep sense of that urgency that just didn't come from friends, right, colleagues and students, but came from inside me. So I think it left me with that. And it left me also with this idea of like, I could become a different kind of intellectual. I used to be a person who wrote about post-World War II French Jewish thought. And then I ended at the margins of nihilism talking about a filmmaker from Senegal and a filmmaker from Cameroon. I was like, maybe you can actually do other kinds of things. And that's not unimportant because like everybody, I doubt my own abilities to do something new. And so
someone's listening and saying, not you doubting your own ability after coming up with 3 books.
I swear to God, though, it's like once they're done, it's like
there's eyes rolling to the back of their heads like, please.
I will, just to cross/intro, because this will be on both platforms, the Black Studies podcast too. I just yesterday recorded a podcast with Imani Perry, and I was, before we recorded, I was talking with her, and I said something about like having a lot of books, her having come out with a lot of books recently. It seems like every 3 or 4 months. And she said, and self-deprecating, but also I understood what she meant. She said, oh, it's all smoke and mirrors. And it definitely, that's that moment I was like, it does feel like a little smoke and mirrors. So it's just like, well, they were like half written, they were 2/3 written, and it kind of this, it kind of that. And that way of like it feeling like a little smoke and mirrors can make you say like, well, I don't know if I have that trick up my sleeve again. But then I also remind myself, as you as a dissertation writer know, actually only you can write a page. And when the page is written, that was you who wrote it. I need to look at 294,000 words, which is the total word count of the 3 books. I did write all those words. Maybe I do have other ones. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I hope the 3 a.m. thoughts attack you again, so that hopefully that'll, give you that urgency with the next book. But yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for making the time. And I actually didn't think about the ending because it's like I always thought about the middle and the beginning, but
yes. Well, I appreciate it, Fatima. We go back a ways. I remember meeting at Starbucks because we had to meet outside because it was still pandemic, talking about whether or not you were going to come here or somewhere else. I won't say where the somewhere else is.
I was going to say.
You can say. I didn't want to speak for you.
It was between Maryland and Wisconsin, yeah.
So you made a great choice for us and hopefully for you.
They were very good with their marketing. They had me with the Wolof. And I was like, sending me cups and these letters in Wolof all the way.
See, you never told me that. Damn, I can't believe we beat that. But we go back ways, and we've been having a lot of conversations about a lot of ideas. We started this Conversations in Atlantic Theory together, and you've sustained it recently. I'll be back in the regular sustaining of it, and so I respect your thinking and your writing and your thoughtfulness so much, and so being able to talk about my books with you is actually a real treat. So thank you for making time for me to talk really for a long time about my projects.
No, thank you for creating the space. And to all graduate students listening, this is not just for me, but if you too are interested, we're always happy to have different voices on here because Dr. Drabinski really did make a space that's not just for Fatima. I've just always wanted, I don't know, I guess, I don't want to say this is a job, but something in life where you just get to read and learn new things. Yeah. And that's the greatest thing about this. I don't have to wait 10 years or 20 years to engage with scholarship. I can read about what's coming out now. And when you said you were doing that, I was like, oh my gosh, can I just read new books and talk about new books? Yeah,
that's what it is. That's what I love about, that's why I got in this profession. I like teaching, I like writing, but I like conversation. I like classes as conversation. And I like this as conversation. So I appreciate you valuing that too.
Thank you.
All right. Well, take care.
You too.